Okay, hello, I'm Bowie, and this is the third short video in the series on just trying to unpack a little bit about liberation theology. The first one introduced sort of the setting, the context of Latin America and the context of the Vatican II changes. And the second then was a short video just exploring a little bit on the idea of the method in liberation theology, a kind of methodological approach. There was a change, a different way of doing theology. And today, or for this video I should say, I'm going to look at some key concepts in liberation theology, so some key ideas. I think probably a key one to begin with is the kingdom of God. It's really a central theme. A really essential theme for liberation theology. Leonardo Boff says that the kingdom is this world made anew. This world made anew. Not some world after we have died. So you've got with liberation theology this movement to focus on this world, this life, what's happening right around us. That's from the Theology of Liberation page, I think 187, Boff's book. So the coming of the kingdom of heaven is seen as something that we must prepare for historically here. Okay, so the kind of idea that there is a coming kingdom, we prepare for this here. We prepare now in this world, in history, in like the time that we're living in. So the history tells us the story of the coming of the kingdom, and the coming of the kingdom is something that is realized around us. It is not projected to some future, some other time after we have gone to heaven. This is kind of, we could link this to ideas like kind of the Beatitudes as being something that we want to realize today. We want to actually, this is a change that must happen. And in something like the Beatitudes, where you've got all of these identification of different practices, virtues, and peoples who are, if you like, condemned by this society: the poor, those who mourn, those who have had injustice done against them. That's kind of God's judgment on this world, and it's an injunction for a revolution, for a change to this world. The Beatitudes show God's judgment on this world, and an injunction or a command for change. There is this revolutionary movement. And this means that there is hope for the oppressed now. It's not a matter of everything's going to be okay in heaven. Don't worry about the fact that your life is miserable, that you're having these difficult times now. No, that's wrong. It's actually, no, things are going to change. There's going to be this change, this revolution. And we are participants in that. So, humans are participants in the change. That's what we're required to do. That's the Christian life. Gutierrez talks about 3 levels of liberation, which he thinks are related. Okay, so we can call these the 3 levels of liberation. And this is Gutierrez. And level 1 is a kind of economic and social liberation. So this is about the freedom of the oppressed. This is in accordance with their aspirations. So bringing people out of the poverty that they live in. And then we've got a second, which is this kind of level where poverty is caused by people. There is enough food, we just don't share it. So as a consequence, people can remedy this if we just do the right thing, if we're fair. We can remedy this poverty. This means, we take responsibility. Yeah, we don't just pray and say, God, make the world, feed the world, please, God. No, it's God saying, okay, God's prayer to us is, okay, guys, feed the world, please. And then the third is about liberation from sin. And so this is about reconciliation with God. And this then leads to the kind of the transformed person. We change. This is that kind of Paul's idea of the changed person, the transformed. And therefore liberation requires all 3 of these. You've got to have everything. You've got to have, the whole picture. You've got to have all 3. And that means that for Gutierrez, the question of political liberation is salvific work. Salvific work. There we go. Political liberation is about salvation. So the Christian concept of salvation, salvation from sin, salvation from death, is also about political liberation in this world. It is about salvation now, here and now, from your current situation, from your suffering. This number 2, this section here, this entails conscientization. Difficult to spell. I don't think if I can spell it just right now. So I have to examine myself. I have to look at what I'm doing, and I have to look at my kind of religious attitude. Okay, so that's a bit messy. Sorry about that. So conscientization. So in order, because we've got to see that we ourselves need to take responsibility. So we have to go through that kind of liberation. And then 3, the liberation from sin thing. This is what's important here is that sin is not just personal. Sin is in social structures. So there are these kind of structures of sin. We've kind of built sin into the system. The system is unfair and it treats some people poorly. This puts sin in history. Sin is like there in the kind of structures of history. Sin is collective. Yeah, if our governments, if our people structure society in a way that means the wealthy get the wealth and the poor starve, then there's a kind of collective responsibility. For Gutierrez, all of this stuff comes from Vatican II. It comes from the idea of joy and hope in Gaudium et Spes, which is one of the key parts of the Vatican II Council. So for Gutierrez, this is absolutely Vatican II applied. This is what happens when you take Vatican II and put it into operation in the poor Latin America that Gutierrez was working in. Okay, so this then raises a question, I suppose, about what we've got a kind of interesting thing going on around here, because one question that we might be beginning to think about, well, is this sense of a kind of spiritual versus political idea of salvation. Okay, liberation and salvation. Spiritual liberation, spiritual salvation, political salvation. Because you've got a kind of revolutionary idea of salvation, which entails, kind of uprising, kind of a change of the structures that are in society. That's a kind of political concept of salvation, rather than a sort of spiritual sense of salvation, which might be something that is perhaps seen as a change within us individually, or perhaps seen as the kind of change that happens after we've left this world. So salvation is put into this world as something that must happen in the here and now. It's much more in the tradition of Moses leading the people from freedom. That kind of sense of a change that must happen in your system, in your structures. There's another kind of consequence of this is if salvation is political as well as or instead of spiritual, perhaps both, but certainly it must be political. You can't not have it. What about ideas like prophecy as well? Prophecy doesn't then mean foreseeing the future, but actually interpreting the present. So if we go back to the sense in which we're going to try and read the signs of the times, if we're going to make sense of the world in which we are perceiving things, then prophecy is the right reading of the signs of the times. In Gutierrez's idea, prophecy equals reading correctly the signs of the times, not looking into the future, not making guesses about the future. So we've got this kind of Gutierrez idea of salvation as being political rather than spiritual, and we've got Gutierrez's idea of prophecy as being reading correctly the signs of the times, not predicting futures. So it's a different kind of sense of prophecy. There are some particularly liberationist perspectives of which we might comment about God. Belief in God and Jesus isn't a problem in Latin America. Okay, so the sort of idea of God that comes from liberation theology is not particularly problematic. Segundo says that people can fashion God into into your own likings. Okay, so this is a sort of a danger of the idea of God that can exist. Okay, so you can see God as a king, and so God can be seen as a sort of supreme ruler over the people in a kind of otherworldly sense. If we go back to that map I drew where there was a kind of, a sort of, if God equals the king, and then the people are down here, and you've got the kind of pyramid of power. And of course this might be dangerous because this seems to justify why the people are poor, because they should be humble, so it's okay for them to be poor, and that God the king is wealthy, and then you get into all those ideas, those medieval ideas, that the king is God's chosen one, that's why he's wealthy, because God is, if you like, the source of all wealth. But this also then means there are other things about this idea of God. God can't suffer because God is kind of a kingly God. Well, how could a king suffer? That seems to be a little bit problematic. And this seems to also take away the idea of justice, because we can sort of justify the difference between the poor people and the God and the court of wealth, because sort of that seems to say, what about fairness, what about justice? God now becomes a bit problematic, a liberationist conception of God. Well, God as this king. If God is associated with the kings of old, and the kings now in Latin America are corrupt governments, and the people need to rise up against government, are they rising up against God? So this is a kind of a bit of a problem for that medieval, that sort of traditional notion of God aligned to rulership. God is the revolutionary, not the ruler. God is the God of Moses, the uprising. The rulers are like Pharaoh. There's a whole bundle of favourite biblical texts that are particularly significant for liberation theologians. The Exodus story, I've kind of been alluding to it with Moses. Exodus and Moses kind of really matter. We've got the Magnificat, the poor servant girl that brings about the message of change, or the messenger of change. We've got those references where Jesus denounces the wealthy, or wealth, when he talks about the concern for the poor, where he tells those hard stories of like the story of the rich man and Lazarus. What will happen to the rich, the camel not being able to pass through the eye of the needle, all that sort of thing. Matthew 25, the judgment of nations. Whatsoever you do for the least of my brothers and sisters, you do to me. So the idea that we encounter Christ in the suffering and the poor, and that there is judgment coming for those who do not recognize the injustice of their situation and recognize the divine in the people that they meet who are in suffering. It's in the notion of the resurrection, the idea that out of failure and out of disaster can come new hope. There can be this revolution, and of course it's strongly there in the Beatitudes. Whatsoever you do for the least, you do for me, is sort of manifest itself across the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the poor, blessed are those against which all kinds of calumny and justice and accusations are made. But there are some interesting questions that we can ask of this. So if we go back to the conception of sin that Gutierrez has, remember, sin was not personal, but it was found in social structures, and we can ask a question. Okay, so what does that mean? What does it mean for a structure to have sin? I mean, I can kind of have an idea of what does it mean for me to commit a sin or for me to be sinful, but But to say, okay, a structure has sin, like my mortgage has sin built in, exactly what does that mean? How can I explain that? And the second thing is this: a lot of this analysis, requires a sort of transformation, the political liberation, the removal of the king, the kind of the revolution, the sort of the revolutionary message. Well, yeah, but we could then ask the question: okay, so what sort of politics and economics is like good for Latin America? What's going to come in? What's going to come to replace? What is this good form, this better form, this more just version? So so these are sort of key questions for some of the big ideas within the writing Gutierrez, but also within the main ideas of liberation theology that are questions that we can ask. Okay, so here ends the third video, and I'll be moving on to explore other aspects of the church and theology, and some more of Gutierrez's thinking and Segundo's thinking, and some of the others in the next video. Thank you.